Welcome back, everyone. Settle in, because what I'm about to tell you tonight is one of those stories that starts as a minor frustration and slowly transforms into something so jaw-dropping, so infuriating, and ultimately so satisfying that by the time we reach the end, you're going to be sitting there with your mouth wide open, shaking your head, wondering how on earth one regular, everyday man, managed to bring an entire HOA board crashing down using nothing but spreadsheets, public records, laws, and an absolutely unshakable refusal to let it go. This is not a story about a villain in a movie. This is not a Netflix drama. This is real life. This happened in a quiet, manicured little suburb where the grass was always perfectly cut. The mailboxes were all the same color, and behind every friendly wave and HOA newsletter, something deeply, fundamentally wrong was going on with the money. A lot of money, and nobody was supposed to find out. But they didn't count on Marcus. Stay with me, because this one is worth every single minute. Let's set the scene. Picture a neighborhood called Cedarbrook Commons. Not a real address I'll give you. We're keeping this just vague enough to protect some of the people involved, but picture it vividly. It's one of those planned communities that exploded in popularity in the mid-2000s during the housing boom. You know the kind. Every house has the same 3 exterior paint color options. Every yard has the same type of mailbox post. The streets curve gently. There are decorative lampposts every 30 feet. And somewhere in the neighborhood, there's a little clubhouse with a pool and a fitness center that smells faintly of chlorine and broken dreams. Cedarbrook Commons had about 412 homes. It had a homeowners association, naturally run by a 5-member board. And for the residents who live there, this HOA was just kind of background noise. Like elevator music. You paid your dues every month, $185. And in exchange, the common areas were maintained, the pool was kept clean, the landscaping got done, and occasionally someone stapled a passive-aggressive letter to your door about your trash bins being visible from the street. Normal HOA stuff. Annoying, but tolerable. Now, into this perfectly manicured, mildly oppressive little world, we introduce Marcus. Marcus was 38 years old when this story begins. He was a mid-level project manager at a logistics company, which, as you'll come to understand, was deeply relevant to what happened next, because project managers are not people who let discrepancies slide. They track things. They document things. They ask, why does this number not match this number, in a way that most people simply never would. Marcus had moved into Cedarbrook Commons 4 years earlier with his wife, Diane, and their 2 kids, a 9-year-old named Sophie and a 7-year-old named Tyler. They bought their house because it was in a great school district, it had a big backyard, and the neighborhood looked well kept. The HOA dues seemed reasonable. Everything looked great on paper. And for the first 2 years, Marcus barely thought about the HOA at all. He paid his dues. He went to work. He coached Tyler's soccer team on weekends. He grilled on Sundays. He was living the suburban dream without questioning any of it. But then came the summer of year 3, and that summer changed everything. It started with the pool. Now, in Cedarbrook Commons, the community pool was a big deal. It was the centerpiece of the neighborhood. 400-plus families paying $185 a month. That's over $75,000 a month in HOA dues. By the way, roughly $900,000 a year. And the crown jewel of that investment was this pool. Kids loved it. Families spent summer evenings there. It was the place where neighbors actually talked to each other. In early June of that 3rd summer, the HOA sent out a newsletter, printed on nice cardstock, which Marcus would later note cost considerably more than an email, announcing that the pool would be closed for the entire summer for critical infrastructure repairs. The newsletter was vague. It said things like necessary maintenance and long-term investment in community infrastructure. It had a stock photo of a wrench. It did not explain what specifically was being repaired, what it would cost, or when residents could expect any kind of update. Marcus read it, frowned slightly, and said to Diane, what's actually wrong with the pool? Diane shrugged. Does it say? No, it says almost nothing. He set it down. He went back to his coffee. But somewhere in the back of his project manager brain, a tiny little flag had been planted. The summer passed. The pool stayed closed. No further updates were sent. And when September rolled around and the pool remained closed, technically into the fall, Marcus started asking questions. He wasn't the only one. His neighbor, a retired teacher named Gloria, had also been frustrated. She told Marcus at the mailbox one afternoon, "I asked Linda from the board about the pool, and she just said it's more complicated than we thought." "What does that even mean?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Did she say anything about the cost?" "No," Gloria said. "And I asked." That was the second flag. Marcus went home, sat down at his computer, and sent a polite email to the HOA board, specifically to the board president, a man named Richard Calloway. Richard was the kind of person who had held the same position for 11 years, who wore polo shirts with the HOA logo on them, and who had the energy of someone who desperately needed everyone around him to understand that he was in charge. Marcus's email was simple and reasonable. He wrote, "Hi, Richard. I wanted to follow up on the pool closure. It's now September, and we haven't received any detailed updates. Would it be possible to get a summary of what repairs were needed, what the cost was, and where those funds came from?" Professional, polite, direct. Richard's response came 3 days later, and it said, "Are you ready for this?" It said, "Hi, Marcus. Thanks for your interest. Pool matters have been handled appropriately by the board. We appreciate your patience. Best, Richard." That was it. That was the entire response. Marcus stared at his screen. He read it again. He leaned back in his chair and thought, handled appropriately. He literally just told me nothing and wrapped it in a bow. He typed back, politely asking for specifics, a contractor name, a repair summary, anything concrete. No response. He waited a week. Nothing. He called the HOA management company. Cedarbrook Commons contracted with a third-party management company called Pinnacle Property Management and was told that all financial questions needed to go through the board. The third flag. The fourth. They were coming faster now. At this point, most people would have let it go. And honestly, that's what the HOA was counting on. That's always what they count on. They count on the fact that you're busy, that you have kids and jobs and lives, that eventually the irritation fades, and you move on, and they never have to answer a single awkward question. But Marcus was not most people. He went down a rabbit hole that, if he's being honest, he has never fully climbed back out of. He started researching HOA law in his state. He learned, and this was enormously important, that in most U.S. states, HOA members have a legal right to inspect the association's financial records. Not all records, not everything, but the financial books, the contracts, the meeting minutes, those belong to the members. The HOA is not a private company operating in secret. It is, in many legal respects, a quasi-governmental body that has been entrusted with residents' money, and residents have rights. Marcus found a state's specific HOA statute. He highlighted the relevant sections. He made notes in the margins like a law student preparing for finals. Then he sent another email to Richard. This time, the email was different in tone. Still polite. Marcus was always relentlessly, unfailingly polite, which, as it turns out, is one of the most effective weapons you can use against someone who is doing something they shouldn't be. But this time, the email cited specific statutes. It formally requested access to the following documents: the last 3 years of audited financial statements, the most recent budget, all contracts entered into in the past 2 years over a certain dollar amount, and the minutes from all board meetings in the past 18 months. He sent it certified mail as well as by email. He kept receipts of everything. And now, suddenly, Richard Calloway had to respond. The response came 7 days later, not from Richard personally, but from a law firm. A letter on crisp letterhead from an attorney named Douglas Farwell, representing the Cedarbrook Commons HOA Board of Directors. The letter acknowledged Marcus's request and informed him that the board was reviewing his inquiry and would respond within the time permitted by applicable law. Marcus showed it to Diane. "They lawyered up," she said. "Over a records request," Marcus replied. There was a long pause. "Marcus," Diane said carefully. "I know," he said. That's really not normal." "I know." And that was the moment, that specific moment, when Marcus went from curious and mildly annoyed to something else entirely. Something focused, something methodical. Because here's the thing about Marcus, and this is important. He was not a confrontational person by nature. He was not someone who enjoyed conflict for its own sake. He didn't want to fight. He genuinely just wanted to know what had happened to the pool money. But when you send a records request for public financial documents and the response is a lawyer's letter, that tells you something. That tells you that whoever is on the other side of that letter is afraid of what those records will show. Marcus quietly opened a new folder on his desktop. He labeled it Cedarbrook Research, and he started filling it. Now, while Marcus was waiting for the HOA to provide documents, he decided to do some preliminary digging on his own. This is where things get interesting, because as it turns out, HOAs are required to file certain documents publicly. Not everything, but things like lien filings, corporate registration, and in some states, annual reports to the state. Marcus found the HOA's corporate registration and pulled it up. Standard stuff. Richard Calloway listed as president, a woman named Sandra Bloom as treasurer, 3 other board members. But then Marcus noticed something. The registered agent for the HOA's corporate entity had changed. About 14 months ago, the registered agent had quietly been switched from a generic legal services company to, and Marcus had to squint at his screen and read it twice, to a company called RCS Property Consultants, LLC. RCS. He wrote that down. He searched for RCS Property Consultants, LLC. The company had been formed 18 months ago. Its registered address was a mailbox at a UPS store about 12 miles away. Its sole member and manager? A man named Richard C. SCH. Well, let's call him Richard C. Something with initials that matched very neatly with RCS. And when Marcus cross-referenced the name, pulled up public records, and dug just a little deeper, RCS Property Consultants, LLC was owned by Richard Calloway, the board president, the same man who had been appropriately handling everything for 11 years. Marcus sat back in his chair. He pressed his palms flat on his desk. He stared at the ceiling for about 30 seconds. Diane, he called. She appeared in the doorway. He turned the screen toward her. She read it. She read it again. Is that the board president? Yes. And the HOA hired his company? I don't know yet, Marcus said, but I'm about to find out. The mandated period for responding to his records request came and went. The HOA provided some documents, not all of them, not even close to all of them, but they sent a partial package. And in that partial package, Marcus found something that made his stomach drop. Among the financial documents, line items in the general ledger, there was a repeating expense. Every single month for the past 14 months, there was a payment to RCS Property Consultants, LLC for management consulting services. The amount varied slightly month to month, but averaged around $4,200. $4,200 a month. For 14 months. To a company owned by the board president. Without, as far as Marcus could tell, any disclosed vote by the full membership to approve this expense. He did the math quickly on a yellow legal pad. Approximately $58,800. Nearly $60,000 paid from residents' HOA dues to a company secretly owned by the board president. All while that same board president was presiding over the HOA, controlling its decisions, and apparently couldn't be bothered to respond to a simple email about a pool closure. Marcus put his pen down. He picked it up. He put it down again. He called his brother-in-law, who was a CPA. He described what he'd found without naming names. That a conflict of interest at minimum, his brother-in-law said immediately. Depending on how it was handled, it could be a breach of fiduciary duty. If it wasn't properly disclosed and voted on by members, that's potentially fraud. Potentially, Marcus said, you need to see whether this was disclosed in meeting minutes, whether members ever voted on it, whether the amounts were documented in annual reports. Marcus looked at his incomplete stack of documents. I need more records. Yeah, his brother-in-law said. You need all the records. Getting all the records was not going to be easy. The HOA had already partially complied and then gone quiet again. Attorney letters had been exchanged. The board, to their credit, or rather, to their self-preservation instinct, had obviously realized that a resident was pulling on a thread. Marcus, being Marcus, approached this the way he approached every complicated project at work. He created a plan. He documented every step. He kept a timeline, and he started reaching out to other residents. This part of the story is one of my favorites honestly. Because Marcus didn't storm around the neighborhood banging on doors and saying, "The HOA is corrupt, come join my crusade." That would have scared people off. Instead, he was subtle. He started showing up at the twice-yearly HOA member meetings. He had never attended these before, and asking calm, measure questions during the open comment period. At the first meeting he attended, he stood up, smiled pleasantly, and asked, "Could someone from the board explain what the line item RCS property consultants in our monthly financials represents? I don't believe I've seen that vendor mentioned in previous budgets." The room went quiet. Richard Calloway, sitting at the front table with the slightly flushed look of a man who has been caught with his hand somewhere it shouldn't be, said, "That's a contracted services arrangement that the board approved in executive session." "Could you explain what services are provided?" Marcus asked. "Administrative consulting," Richard said. "Could you specify?" The board determined this was necessary for operational efficiency. "Could the membership see the contract?" Richard smiled thinly. "That'll be included in our next document release." It never was. But something else happened that night. After the meeting, 3 separate residents came up to Marcus. A man named Pete, who had been in the neighborhood for 6 years. A younger couple named the Nguyen's, who had moved in just under a year ago and had already had multiple run-ins with the board over fence regulations. And Gloria, good old Gloria from the mailbox conversation. What was that about? Pete asked quietly. Marcus explained what he'd found. The Nguyen's exchanged a look. "We've been wondering why our dues went up 8% last year," the wife said. Gloria said, simply, "What do we do?" Marcus looked at the 4 of them. "We get organized," he said, "and we get all the records." The next phase of this story involves something deeply unglamorous but absolutely devastating in its effectiveness. A coalition of 5 neighbors, a shared Google Drive folder, and what Marcus's kids would later refer to as Dad's HOA homework. Nearly every evening for the next 6 weeks, after dinner, after helping with homework, after the kids were in bed, Marcus would sit at his kitchen table with his laptop and work. He was methodical. He filed additional records requests, not just to the HOA, but to county offices where HOA liens are recorded. He found 3 residents who had been hit with fines and liens they had no idea were legally questionable. He pulled corporate filings and cross-referenced dates. He built a timeline spreadsheet that was, by the end, 43 rows long. Pete, it turned out, had some experience with accounting, and he started reviewing the financial documents they had. The Nguyen's were young and tech-savvy and helped track down public information online. Gloria, bless her heart, had incredible social capital in the neighborhood. She had lived there longer than almost anyone and knew everyone. And when she started quietly asking questions and listening to people, the stories started coming out. The pool wasn't the only thing. There was a resurfacing project for the community parking lot that had been listed as costing $82,000. But several residents who worked in construction whispered to Gloria that the work looked like it cost maybe $35,000 to $40,000 tops. There was a landscaping contract that had quietly switched providers at some point, and the new provider, residents noticed, did noticeably inferior work for what the financial suggested was a higher price. And there was a special assessment 2 years ago, a one-time charge of $250 levied on every household that had been listed as going toward a reserve fund replenishment. 412 households times $250. Over $100,000. For a reserve fund that, according to the documents Marcus now had, showed no corresponding increase. Where had that money gone? When Marcus mapped it all out in his spreadsheet, color-coded, time-stamped, cross-referenced, the pattern that emerged was not subtle. Over approximately 3 years, somewhere between $150,000 and potentially $200,000 in residents' money appeared to have been misallocated, misspent, or directed to entities and circumstances that could not be satisfactorily explained by the documents provided. He printed the spreadsheet out. It was 11 pages long. He sat with it for a long time. Then he called Pete and said, "I think it's time we got a lawyer." Now here's where I want to pause and give you a sense of the pressure these 5 residents were under, because it wasn't nothing. The HOA, perhaps sensing that things were escalating, began to push back in the ways that HOAs always push back when they feel threatened. 2 weeks after that member meeting, where Marcus had asked his polite, pointed questions, he received a violation notice in the mail. His fence gate, it said, was a non-compliant color. He needed to repaint it within 30 days or face a $25 per day fine. Marcus walked out and looked at his fence gate. It was the same color it had been for 4 years. He photographed it. He pulled the HOA's governing documents and found the relevant color standards. His gate was compliant. He sent a written response with photographs and the specific document citations and said, politely, that he disagreed with this notice and believed it to be without basis. A week later, Pete received a notice about his driveway, allegedly cracked beyond acceptable limits. Pete had just had his driveway resealed that spring. Then Gwen's got a notice about a potted plant on their front porch being in violation of the entryway standards section of the HOA rules, a section that, when they looked it up, did not actually prohibit potted plants. Gloria, somewhat magnificently, did not receive a single violation notice because Gloria had been the woman who brought food to board members' families when people were sick, and apparently even petty HOA retaliation has its limits. Marcus documented every notice. He photographed everything. He kept every letter. He wrote a group email to his 4 allies that said, simply, they're scared. That's good. It means we're on the right track. Don't engage emotionally. Document everything. Stay the course. The lawyer they found was a woman named Helen Park, who specialized in community association law. When Marcus laid everything out for her, the spreadsheet, the documents, the Richard Callaway/RCS connection, the special assessment discrepancy, all of it, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This is pretty serious." "We think so too," Marcus said. "I need you to understand something," Helen said. "You can pursue this civilly. Sue for breach of fiduciary duty, seek disgorgement of the funds. Or you can take this to the state attorney general's office, because HOA fraud can be a criminal matter in your state. Or both. But either way, the first step is getting all the documents, which your HOA has been improperly withholding. I can help with that." The next morning, Helen Park sent a formal legal demand letter to the HOA and to Pinnacle Property Management, the third-party management company. The letter cited specific state statutes, demanded complete financial records going back for years, threatened sanctions for improper withholding of documents, and gave them 15 days to comply. Pinnacle Property Management, apparently not interested in being on the wrong side of a legal proceeding, responded in 8 days. With everything. Complete financial records, 4 years of bank statements, all contracts, all vendor agreements, all meeting minutes, the full reserve fund history. Everything. Marcus stayed up until 2 in the morning the night those documents arrived. He and Pete sat at his kitchen table surrounded by printed pages, highlighters in hand, working through it methodically, cross-referencing with the spreadsheet. And what they found was worse than what they'd suspected. The complete picture, once they had all the pieces, looked like this. Richard Callaway, as board president, had awarded his own company, RCS Property Consultants, LLC, a rolling consulting contract that had never been presented to the full membership for a vote, had never been disclosed in meeting minutes as a conflict of interest, and had quietly consumed approximately $63,000 over 14 months. This was a clear, documented violation of the state's HOA statutes, which required disclosure and member approval for any transaction where a board member had a personal financial interest. The pool closure, which had been the original mystery, remember, the thing that started all of this, had been listed as a $54,000 repair project. But when Marcus and Pete dug into it, the contractor who had been paid for the pool work, a company called Lakeview Aquatic Solutions, barely registered, only a few years old, and its listed principal was, you can probably see where this is going, someone with the same surname as Sandra Bloom, the board treasurer, a brother, who had done what, based on subsequent investigation, turned out to be about $30,000 of actual work and billed $54,000 for it. The special assessment, the $100,000+ levied 2 years ago for reserve fund replenishment, had indeed gone into the reserve fund account. But then, over the subsequent months, it had been transferred out in portions and applied to, among other things, the RCS consulting payments and several invoices for vendors who, upon examination, bore troubling similarities to the family and associates pattern already being uncovered. The landscaping contract switch? The new provider was marginally more expensive than the previous one and did worse work. Yes. And while this one was harder to directly tie to board members, the timeline of the switch lined up suspiciously with a period when one of the other board members had reportedly gotten into a personal dispute with the old landscaping company's owner. When Helen Park saw the full picture, she set her pen down and looked at Marcus. You know, she said, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I want you to know what you put together here. The documentation, the timeline, the cross-referencing, this is genuinely exceptional work. Most people never get this far. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my dues went toward this. 400 families' dues went toward this. I just want to know why the pool was closed. The next step was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Helen filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, which in their state had jurisdiction over HOA fraud. She also filed a civil suit on behalf of the 5-resident coalition against the HOA board individually and collectively, seeking the return of all improperly spent funds plus legal costs. And then Marcus did something that nobody in the neighborhood expected. He organized a community meeting, not an HOA meeting. Those were controlled by the board. A neighborhood meeting. He reserved a room at the local library for a Tuesday evening and sent handwritten invitations, not emails, handwritten notes, to every single house in Cedarbrook Commons. He kept the invitation simple. We need to talk about our HOA finances. There is important information every homeowner should know. No agenda. No drama. Just facts. Tuesday, 7 p.m., library. Coffee provided. He and Diane spent a Sunday afternoon hand-delivering them. 63 residents showed up that Tuesday night. Marcus stood at the front of the room with a projector. Yes, he made slides, because of course he did, and calmly walked through everything he had found. Not accusations. Not hysteria. Facts, numbers, documents, and dates. He handed out a 4-page summary that Gloria had helped him write in clear, plain language that anyone could understand. The room was very, very quiet while he presented. And then there was a period of about 10 seconds of absolute silence. And then everyone started talking at once. Some people were furious. Some were disbelieving. One man in a golf shirt stood up and said this had to be a misunderstanding. Richard had been running things fine for years. And someone in the back muttered, that's what they said about Bernie Madoff too. Some people were just sad. One older woman near the front, who had lived in Cedarbrook Commons since it was built, started crying quietly. She trusted this neighborhood. She trusted these people. By the end of the meeting, 41 residents had signed onto the formal complaint to the Attorney General. 27 had agreed to be part of the civil suit if needed. And most importantly, and this was the move that Marcus had been planning quietly for weeks, enough residents signed a petition to trigger a special election to remove the current board and install an emergency interim board. Under their HOA's governing documents, those same governing documents Marcus had spent 6 weeks memorizing, a petition signed by 30% of the membership could force a special vote on board removal. With 412 homes, that meant he needed signatures from roughly 124 households. He had 141 before he left the library that night. Richard Calloway found out about the community meeting the next morning, and Marcus later heard, through Gloria, who heard through the neighborhood grapevine, which is its own extraordinary intelligence network, that Richard's reaction was memorable. Apparently, he called Sandra Bloom in a panic and said something along the lines of, "Who does this guy think he is? He's just some project manager. He can't just, we have a lawyer." And Sandra, to her somewhat limited credit, apparently said, "Richard, he has all the bank statements." There was a pause, and then Richard said, "What do you mean he has all the bank statements?" The management company gave them everything. Helen Park sent a legal demand. They had to comply. There was another pause, longer this time. "We need to get ahead of this," Richard said. But it was too late to get ahead of it. You can't get ahead of a train when you've been standing on the tracks for 14 months collecting payments from a company you secretly own. The board tried several last-ditch maneuvers. They sent out a newsletter, still on nice cardstock, that characterized the whole situation as a misunderstanding by a small group of agitators. They hired a second attorney who sent Marcus a letter suggesting his campaign of harassment could expose him to legal liability. They called an emergency board meeting and, in executive session, voted to deny the petition for a special election on technical grounds, claiming the signature-gathering process had procedural errors. This was a mistake. This was such a mistake, because Helen Park filed an emergency injunction the very next day, arguing that the board's denial of the petition was itself a violation of state HOA law, and that the continued operation of the board under these circumstances represented an ongoing harm to members. The court agreed. A judge, who, I imagine, was not particularly impressed by 11 pages of spreadsheet evidence in an HOA dispute, ordered that the special election proceed. 3 weeks later, in a vote conducted by an independent third party, all 5 current board members were removed from their positions. Richard Callaway lost by 308 votes to 4. He got 4 votes, one of which was almost certainly his own, and the other 3 were presumably close friends or people who genuinely hadn't followed what was happening. And even then, the story wasn't over. Because elections are one thing, but accountability, real accountability, is something else. The Attorney General's office launched a formal investigation. This took several months. These things moved slowly, as Marcus and his coalition learned, and there were stretches of time where nothing seemed to be happening, and people started asking him, "Is anything going to come of this?" And he said, "Honestly, I don't know. But we did the right thing. We kept documenting. We kept following the rules. That's all we can do." During this waiting period, something small but beautiful happened. The new interim board, made up of residents who had volunteered, people like Pete and one of Nguyen's and a retired attorney who lived on the east side of the neighborhood, conducted a full independent financial audit. A real one, by a real CPA firm with no conflicts of interest. The audit confirmed everything Marcus's spreadsheet had shown, plus a few additional items they hadn't caught. The total amount of funds that had been improperly directed, double-billed, or misappropriated came to just under $220,000. $220,000 out of a neighborhood of 412 families. The audit report was sent to every household. It was also sent to the Attorney General's office, to the civil court handling the lawsuit, and because Marcus believed strongly in transparency as a matter of principle, it was made available as a public document at the community library. The civil lawsuit was settled. Richard Callaway and Sandra Bloom, who had, it emerged, known about and facilitated several of the transactions in her role as treasurer, agreed to a settlement that required them to jointly pay back $160,000. The rest of the money was pursued through the HOA's insurance policy, which had a director's and officer's liability provision. It was a complicated process. It took months, but the bulk of the money came back. The Attorney General's investigation, when it concluded, resulted in Richard Callaway being charged with 2 counts of theft by exploitation and 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty, all felony charges in their state. He eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, received a suspended prison sentence, was placed on probation, and was permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any homeowners association in the state. Sandra Bloom received a lesser charge, paid a fine, and was similarly barred from HOA board service. The other board members, who had less direct involvement in the financial misconduct, but had clearly known or should have known what was happening, faced no criminal charges but were named in the civil suit and faced reputational consequences that, in a neighborhood this size, are significant in their own right. And what about Marcus? Marcus went back to being a project manager. He went back to coaching Tyler's soccer team on weekends. He went back to grilling on Sundays. He was still in Cedarbrook Commons, still paying his HOA dues, though those were now $3 a month lower than before, because it turned out the inflated vendors and undisclosed consulting fees had been quietly baked into the budget for years. Gloria baked him a pie, an actual pie. It was apple, and he said it was the best thing he'd ever eaten. Pete put up a sign in his front window, just for a week, just because he couldn't help himself, that said, "Transparency in our community." The new board asked him to take it down after 7 days on the grounds that it was technically a non-compliant sign under HOA regulations, and Pete took it down cheerfully because the new board had a point, and also because the new board wasn't stealing anyone's money, so he was inclined to be cooperative. The pool reopened the following spring, fully repaired. Actual repairs this time by a real, arm's-length contractor who submitted real bids that the new board actually reviewed. The total cost? $31,000. Not $54,000. On opening day, Marcus brought the kids to the pool. Sophie cannonballed into the shallow end immediately. Tyler spent 20 minutes working up the courage to try the diving board and then did it, surface sputtering and laughing, and said, "Dad, can we come every day?" "Every single day," Marcus said. He sat in a pool chair in the afternoon sun and watched his kids play in the water that their community had paid for and that now, finally, actually belonged to them. Diane sat down next to him with 2 cans of lemonade from the vending machine that the new board had installed near the bathrooms as a small revenue-generating improvement. "How does it feel?" she asked. Marcus thought about it for a moment. "Anticlimactic," he said, "in the best possible way." She laughed. He laughed. And Tyler did the diving board again. Now I want to take a step back from the story for a moment, because this story, as satisfying as it is, carries lessons that go beyond one neighborhood and one corrupt board president. These are lessons that apply to millions of Americans and people worldwide who live in HOA-governed communities. And I think they're worth sitting with. The first lesson is this: silence is not the same as consent, and ignorance is not the same as trust. 400 families had been paying their dues for years, trusting that the money was being handled properly, and a significant portion of it had been quietly siphoned away. This wasn't because those families were naive or foolish. It's because HOAs specifically, and many similar institutions in our lives, are designed in a way that makes it easy to pay attention to something else. They send newsletters that are long and boring. They hold meetings at inconvenient times. They use jargon that discourages engagement. And every one of those design features, whether intentional or not, protects the people in charge from accountability. The second lesson is documentation is a superpower. What Marcus had that turned a frustrating situation into a successful campaign for justice was not wealth or connections or luck. It was records. It was a spreadsheet. It was certified mail receipts and photographs of a fence gate and printed copies of county filings. The people who were stealing were counting on the fact that no one would bother to track things closely enough. When one person started tracking things closely enough, the whole structure collapsed. The third lesson, and this one is important, is know your rights. In most U.S. states, HOA members have robust legal rights to financial transparency, to records access, to petition for elections, and to hold board members personally accountable for breaches of fiduciary duty. These rights exist. They are powerful. They are routinely ignored by HOA boards because residents don't know about them. Marcus knew them because he looked them up. You can look them up too. In the show notes for this video, I'm going to link to a resource that covers HOA member rights by state. Take 5 minutes and find out what you have access to. Because if something ever starts to feel wrong, if the pool closes without explanation, if dues go up without a clear reason, if questions get answered with lawyer letters, you're going to want to know those rights before you need them, not after. The fourth lesson is you don't have to do it alone. Marcus was smart and methodical, and he did a lot of the heavy lifting. But without Gloria's social network, without Pete's accounting knowledge, without the Nguyen's energy and technical skills, without Helen Park's legal expertise, and ultimately without the 41 residents who signed the Attorney General complaint and the 141 who signed the petition, without all of that, it might have stayed one man's frustrated emails and a politely ignored records request. Find your people. Build your coalition. Quiet, persistent, organized community action is one of the most effective forces in a democratic society. And the fifth lesson, maybe the most important one, is simply pay attention. Not obsessively, not with constant suspicion, but with the basic ongoing awareness that organizations managing other people's money, HOAs, condo boards, small nonprofits, neighborhood committees, all of it, are not immune to human nature. Most people running these things are doing their best. Most of them are fine, but some are not. And the difference between the ones who get away with it and the ones Who don't is almost always whether someone was paying enough attention to notice that something was a little off. A pool closed without explanation. An email answered with nothing but a bow on top. A lawyer's letter about financial records. Marcus noticed, and then he did something about it. I want to end on something that Marcus apparently said during one of the later stages of this whole process, when the investigation was ongoing and things were slow, and people in the neighborhood were sometimes frustrated, asking when it would be over, asking whether it was worth it. Someone at a community meeting asked him, was it worth it? All this time, all this effort, all the stress, was it worth it? And Marcus was quiet for a moment. In that way, he apparently had. And then he said, I have 2 kids. They're going to grow up in this neighborhood. They're going to grow up in a world full of institutions and organizations that they're going to have to decide whether to trust. And I wanted them to see what it looks like when one of those institutions isn't doing what it said it would do. And I wanted them to see what it looks like when you don't just accept that. When you go looking, when you document things, when you find people who care about the same thing and you work together and you see it through. He paused again. My daughter asked me last week why I was always doing HOA homework, he said, and a few people laughed. And I tried to explain it to her. She's 9. She said, so the people who were supposed to take care of the neighborhood were taking the money? And I said yes. And she said, and you figured it out? And I said we all did together. And she thought about it and said, that's kind of like a superpower. He smiled a little. I mean, she's not wrong. And that's the story of Cedarbrook Commons. A neighborhood where the grass was always cut, the mailboxes all matched, and behind the HOA's polished newsletters, something had been quietly, systematically going wrong. Until one man asked a question, and kept asking, and kept documenting, and refused to stop until the records revealed everything. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own HOA, your own community, your own willingness to ask questions, I hope you'll carry a little of that energy forward. Check your HOA's financials. Attend a board meeting. Know your rights. You don't have to be a crusader. You don't have to spend 6 weeks building a 43-row spreadsheet. You just have to be someone who pays enough attention to notice when something is a little off. And if something is a little off, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.